for her that all right, I got to do something here. We had so many questions for her that we actually ran out of time. Her book was fascinating, and it's called Light from the Cage, 25 Years in a Prison Classroom. I encourage everybody to get a copy and read it. It was just fascinating. And so was Judy's discussion. So right then and there, we asked her to come back this year, continue her talk, and just relate some more of the fascinating stories she was telling. I happened to read the book, and I thought there were a lot of insights as far as cross-cultural differences, but that's, I was in adult ed, as many of us in this group are or were teachers. And I was just fascinated with the insights that I read about in terms of cultural differences and understanding the other. And we asked Judy to come back this time and speak specifically to that and what she learned in her years there at the federal penitentiary at Milan, and as a teacher in the adult, let's see, it wasn't the GED program, it was the program for getting a diploma, high school diploma, if I remember correctly. And she seemed to have a lot of insight in terms of the different cultures and their misunderstandings at first, and then how they actually got together and worked together and overcame these misunderstandings and differences. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Judy Wenzel as our speaker for this evening.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm delighted to be back. I'd like to, has anyone not heard me before? Okay, so briefly, I taught 25 years in this high school completion program. I hope I can fill in for you. I want to discuss three things tonight. One, belonging. Two, fear and anger. And three, hope. I would guess, I'd put 100% on it, that we're all living in a lot of unrest and fear and anger, and it's not very pretty in the United States right now. And I'm trying to figure out how to keep myself centered, figure out what I should do, go back to my classroom, what did I learn there, and so forth. I'm going to talk about Brian Stevenson. I'm betting that you all know who he is. I've just heard that he's our Nelson Mandela. Now, isn't that perfect? And that's so true. He says, and this resonates so much for me, that we are all so much more than the worst thing we've ever done. People in prison are not their crimes. They just aren't. They are human beings with all kinds of issues and problems and promise and all kinds of things. They are not just their crimes. The United States is a very punitive place, as I'm sure you're all aware of. And it divides us. And there's such an effort on the right now to divide us. So I want to talk about those people who are on the margins and why they're on the margins and how we keep them there, and about proximity and how important it is to get close to people on the margins and how difficult it is. I had what I call the privilege of proximity. I could go to work every day and be among, well, there were 1,500 people. Our count was about 1,500. That many people who were all very different than I was in terms of background and culture and language and experience and education. And they had grown up in situations that I couldn't and can't begin to understand. The biggest one for me in this discussion is education. And what I saw was the school to prison pipeline. And I always remember one guy saying one day, you know, the biggest mistake I ever made was not going to prison and getting arrested. It was dropping out of school. Dropping out of school is a terrible mistake, really long lasting. Thank goodness there are adult ed programs, but boy, does it take them a long time to get their school wheels back on. It takes them months to get their confidence back, their skills up to speed. But I had a classroom with all ages of people, all kinds of cultural groups, people from all over the world. And one of the things almost all of them shared was that they wanted help and they wanted to help. There was a great deal of, we were isolated. I had this actually quite nice classroom. I had a really high ceiling place and it was clean. It had carpeting. It's kind of a funny shape, but it gave us a sort of sense of, what's the word I want? A sort of reverent sense. You didn't come into a little classroom that was noisy, and there was respect about it for some reason. And they were all so nice to each other. And I was fascinated by, no, let me say this first. I am very worried about the current discussions and anger and fear and resentment about our curriculum. And we're not supposed to teach anything. We wouldn't want those poor little white kids to feel a little uncomfortable. This is terrible. And what I know from my men was, okay, they were adults and more mature, but it is so much richer when you can learn about other people, when you learn about the differences and you learn about what we all have in common. So it's not an either or, it's a both and it challenges people. And when I hear that, the thing I hear most is, we don't want white kids to feel guilty about slavery. Now, come on, they did not start slavery. But talking about slavery is really, really hard. And if I were a principal of a middle school or a high school or any of the schools, I would want training in how you do that, because it's real easy to get in trouble. It's a very sensitive, we aren't done with it, as you all know. It's still around. When Brian Stevenson says slavery hasn't ended, it has just it's just evolved. We now have prisons. So in my classroom, it was really touchy to talk about slavery because they felt like slaves. They were making $1.25 an hour at the highest when I was there for working 8 hours a day. Everybody worked. So they felt like slaves. But it's important to talk about it, and to talk about not only slavery, but to bring in the people who resisted it, both the runaway slaves who were hidden and helped to go north, the Underground Railroad, the people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the books. I mean, there's so much richness in it. It doesn't all have to be negative. And what happened, I taught English, civics, and US history. And I learned, boy, and let me say, I know you've heard this before, but I cannot tell you how unprepared I was. I knew nothing. And and back then the materials were in the 80s and 90s were ridiculous, just ridiculous. But when we got better materials, and we finally did get really good materials, my students gobbled it up. And my students of color just woke up and became alive and got so excited, and they would.
You muted yourself, Judy, by accident. We missed your last sentence.
Well, that's weird. What I'm saying is, when I gave them these materials, these beautiful books with all kinds of people, all kinds of books, pictures, they just, and I had to buy new ones every year because they take them. They would ask me if I could have them and I'd say no. And then they'd say, oh, I forgot to give it back. So that got to be kind of a problem. But I understood that. I mean, they went like this. They were just fascinated with these books. And I often think, how would we feel as white people if we went into a classroom and went through high school with absolutely nothing about us, that it was all about somebody else? That would be really hard. It's hard for us to even imagine that. So they were, for all levels, they were really, really into it. For white students, one of the difficult assignments I gave them in the civics class is they had to write about their own cultural identity. Now, for the natives who came off a reservation in South Dakota, they just whipped that out, no problem, and in no time. The Black students had a hard time. It felt negative to them. They didn't see anything positive. What they heard, what their heads went to is slavery. They didn't understand the richness of their own culture. I also had men from Africa, and to make that connection was very rich. So that had to happen, and I learned to bring Africa in. Hispanic students really had no problem. They were culturally very comfortable. White students, and I want some feedback when we have some questions, white students were very uncomfortable because most of us don't have a clear cultural identity. So we're a hodgepodge, we're a mix. And so I'd say, well, I have one Irish great grandfather, and I decided I'm Irish because I resonate with that. And if anybody wants to argue with me, find something else to do. It doesn't matter. What is it that in your culture, the music, the stories, the history, the struggles, the joys, the triumphs, what is it that resonates with you? And I had to pull it out of them like teeth. It was really hard with a lot of them. But I want to hear your feedback when we get there. It was a constant steep learning curve to be in that classroom. Till the day I left, I was challenged. And I'm sure many of you are teachers and you'd feel the same way. There's always a student that you think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with him or her? But it was also the curriculum that I hear things. I worked really hard to learn Black history, and I still hear names and I think, who's that? I thought I knew it well. I don't. So that was really, really good. They were angry. I dealt with anger, and who could blame them? And anger, I had to kind of push the anger aside and get them working on work, because it was real easy for them to go to the angry box and be sitting there being pissed off all day. But fear and anger are so prevalent right now. And it seems to me that a lot of our divisions along racial and cultural lines are about our fears. And then the anger is what comes out of the fears. So I'm not sure what it is. And of course, it's a million different things and a million different people. But there is a fear, I know, about this issue of slavery, that not only do we not want our children learning about it, but they might come and get us if they know what really happens. We don't want to go back there. It's too painful. So I wonder, I kind of sense this. I don't hear this exactly articulated, but I think it's interesting. And anger and fear are the tools of injustice and oppression. That's how we get it. You can't have injustice and oppression without fear and anger. And on the right, it's about fear and anger all the time. Donald Trump is a genius at stoking all that stuff. So how do we counteract that? And I'm not sure, but I think in ways that we need more creative ways to look that in the face and come at it from a different angle. And I don't know what that is, but the divisions really bother me. And as I say, I've been in a place where there should be very deep divides, and that's not what I found at all. They were so good about working together. Not always, and there's always one little pickle. I say, they were pretty good about and cooperative about slavery. But one Black man got up. He was a very helpful guy. He was a new student. I didn't know him very well. Very helpful and wanted to, help me with books and blah, blah, blah. And we started on this civil rights discussion. And he got up from the back of the room. He said, "God damn it, I'm not staying in here." He slammed the door. He was really upset. So when I talked to him, finally calmed him down, his father had been killed in one of the civil rights demonstrations. So they come from horrendous places. And another little tiny white kid, completely covered in tattoos, a problem in every class. God knows where he came from. He would not have it if it was about anything other than white. He couldn't handle it. We had to finally pull him out of the class. He was not going to do it. He didn't graduate. And there were people like that. So I don't want to paint too pretty a picture, because there were problems, but I'm interested in it because there's this huge fuss now about we're going backwards. We're saying we can only learn about white people. Can't learn about anybody else. The Native students were amazing. They came in, and when I got there, 6% of our population were natives, and mainly from places like the Dakotas, the reservations in the middle of the country. And we were the nearest prison. They tried kind of hard to put people near their homes. So Milan is the only federal prison in Michigan, and if it's a crime on a Indian reservation, it's a federal crime. So they come to federal facilities. And they were very quiet when they were new students. They said nothing for a long time. And then we'd finally tease it out. And they had wonderful stories. And nobody was more settled into their cultural identity than the Native students. They knew who they were. So they added so much. And we all loved it when we had at least one, and preferably even more of them in our classes. In my literature class, this will illustrate, I taught English. I had I can still see it, a big, thick American literature textbook. And I opened it up, and when I first got there, I thought, well, it was old. They just gave us all the old junk. They didn't give us good stuff. And later I thought there were 2 pages in this pretty thick book that had African-American spirituals. That was it. This was published in the 1970s. So we've come a long way in the last decades of getting curriculum that isn't all white. And by the way, my African-American students, most of them had never heard Black spirituals. They didn't know them, which shocked me. So they went crazy about them. So I bought a bunch of CDs, and one guy begged to come into my room over the lunch hour. I had a little bit of time before classes started. "Please, can I come in? I gotta listen to them songs. I just love those songs." So there were things, and I got surprised all the time. But that, I keep saying that the diversity of students made such richness. And if they learned 1/4 of what I learned, I would be really happy. So back to, how do we belong? How do we belong to each other? What are the ways that as Americans in this very tenuous time, how do we reach out? How do we find proximity? I guess the first step is we learn about other people rather than ourselves. And it's very hard for white people to understand our privilege, right? It's fish swimming in water. It's what we do. So I I try really hard to talk to Black people and say, call me on it. Just tell me what don't I see? What don't I understand? And it's sometimes subtle and sometimes glaring, but to read African-American authors, to look at their stories. I just read about, I'm going to forget her name, the Black actress who won all the awards. I'll think of it. Anyway, and she grew up with, such an amazing story, with rats crawling around her head. And, there are white kids like that grow up like that. I'm not saying that, but that's something you and I'm guessing, don't have a history of. So it's, again, these deep divides, and how can we at least learn about some of these situations, and how we grow up then is so determinative of what we do as adults. And it was when I look at my students and heard, I knew men for sometimes 3 or 4 semesters, so I got to know them really well. And I think, how in the world are you functioning after what you've been through? It
really?
shocked me. They were amazing. Just, they were tough. They were tough. They were survivors. So how do we belong to each other? How do we replace the fear and anger with something that's more positive? What does hope look like? It isn't easy. It isn't. The task we have ahead of us as American citizens feels, I don't know about you, but it feels overwhelming to me. I'm going to go to Canada this week, and I may just stay there. It feels just crushing on some days to hear some of this nonsense. And I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, but so much of it seems to go back to race. And it's about our fears of the other. And I used to say, my students would say, we go to the chow hall and we all sit in little groups. We all sit in little groups. So the natives are over here and the Puerto Ricans are here, and the white guys sit over here. And I'd say, well, if I go to a party by myself, I'm not going to walk over to a group of people I don't know. I'm going to find somebody I know. It's a both and. We need each other. We're tribal, but we also need to stretch ourselves and learn from other people and get in other situations. And I think our tendency is just to stick with ourselves. We like to be comfortable, and we're all different, but I think you know what I'm saying. So let me think, what else can I talk about here? Respect was had to be taught in some instances, but those cultural differences were a good way to start that, to have a discussion about what respect looks like. And because I had so many ages, I could, there's a wonderful children's book called House of 60 Fathers. This is one of the chapters in my book. My kids just love that story. And that's what I thought. I live in a house of 60 fathers, that older men would often put their arms around younger men and say, okay, buddy, let's go talk about that. A lot of older men had committed crimes when they were younger and simply grown out of it. That's another thing about prisons, that we don't allow people to grow up and grow out of it and become better people. If they get a 20-year sentence, by golly, they're staying for 20 years and they're still bad people. We are so short-sighted and so prejudicial about this. And I had younger men that would take care of older men. So, and lots of Hispanics needed help with English, and that happened back in their units. It happened on the rec yard. A lot of men learned Spanish. That was the other second language. But it was, gosh, I miss it. I miss it. Prisons do two things really well. They keep people in, if you've seen Milan, there's a double row of fence that's very high. There's what they call no man's land in between. And both fences have big loops of razor wire. Now you're not going to get out. You're not going to get over the fence. You can get out. One guy was, when they're short, when they're ready to go home, they're short. And sometimes they can work out in the yard and plow snow and cut grass and stuff. And one guy he thought, well, I'll just take the truck and go see my woman. So he didn't get away with it. Another guy, I mean, we had several escapes, but it was the kind of thing that was just, it was surprising all the time. Every day I would go and think, I put on my belt and my chain and my keys and my body alarm, and I think, okay, what's going to happen today? Very few days were boring. Long and tedious, yes, but not boring, not boring. There was always something going on. So, time for questions? Yes.
Tada,
Yeah.
is it okay if I talk?
Yes.
You bet.
Okay, you said you were interested in our feedback, so I do have some feedback for you. I'd just like to say that I really appreciate your talk, and your subject matter really interests me and perked me up here. And I just wanted to tell you too that I think one of our problems is that I heard this on PBS one time, or National Public Radio, that, you know, the rehabilitation system, as I prefer to call it in the United States, is based on the 3 R's: retribution, retaliation, and revenge. And if you're good at all 3 R's, you get a 4th R, reelected. I thought that's the best thing that I've ever heard that describes that. But anyway, you were interested in some feedback. I was fascinated. I just thought I'd let you know about my background. I was raised in Royal Oak. I went to high school and middle school and elementary school, and I never went to school with a Black person. Never. Didn't. So I was never exposed to anybody Black. I think we had a couple of people from the Philippines, but that was it. That was my exposure my whole life. And I kind of felt guilty because my family, we can trace our ancestors back to the Revolutionary War. So I remember the expression Heinz 57. I don't know if you remember that one, you know, people who didn't have a particular ethnic group, which I was, and there were a lot of people in Royal Oak were in that boat too. And so anyway, I'll get to another thing. So that was, when I graduated and went to college, I went into Detroit to work. And in college, I started hanging out with ethnic groups, people from Polish community and Italian, and I loved it, learning about their culture and their food and everything, and going to restaurants on the west side of Detroit, Polish restaurants or Italian restaurants on the east side of Detroit. And I just found it so stimulating. And long story short, I ended up in Detroit and working there my whole life with Medicaid patients. And I was always probably the only Black in the office. And I loved it. And I learned the hard way, you know, slowly, like you said, you know, I had to be careful because their perceptions were different. Like I would like a TV show and they'd say, wait a minute, that's racist, you know. And I remember one time mentioning the riots in the late 60s. I just said, that wasn't a riot, that was social unrest. And so I learned so much, you know, their perceptions. And I cherish what I've learned. And I've been on many boards, police, community boards in the city, and working on welfare rights and things like that through my life. And I've learned so much, you know, through that experience. But I had to choose it myself. Why I went that road, I couldn't tell you. But I've learned so much from them. And I just wanted to tell you too that I kind of wonder, you know, it's, you know, I got to thinking about listening to you, and I wondered, maybe why this resurgence in Christian nationalism is because people like me who are white and really didn't have an ethnic group maybe are focusing on their Christianity, that tends to lump them together and make them feel like they do have a tribe, whereas the blacks and Latinos and other ethnic groups, they're more obvious to us, maybe, but
Right. That's a very
but
interesting.
I'm thinking why maybe that's why this resurgence, because people like my ilk, we really didn't have an ethnic group. But I kind of like that idea. It's made me open to everything, and I adapt a little bit of everything. I like Italian food, Polish food. I even used to go to Janie's on Mac and East Grand Boulevard to have some of their tasty macaroni and cheese and other things that I used to have, their okra and corn and tomato and those kinds of things. And also one other thing, and then I'll shut up, is I think too, another thing is American exceptionalism, tends to be a block for us too, because I remember I worked with somebody, his name was Mike Hamlin. He was very active in the, very politically active in the labor movement. He was Black, and he's since deceased. But I'll never forget, he told me, he told his children, and this is back in the 70s. He said, I told my children, don't look at the United States as the only place you can live. He said, the whole world out there. And I took that to heart, and he's right. And I think a lot of that can block our perceptions too.
Yeah. Thank you.
So that's my 2 cents. I thought I'd share that with you. Thank you so much, because you really spurred my my thinking here. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Bob Pozakowski's hand is up. It's the only hand I see. Oh.
Well, it's a virtual hand anyway.
Okay.
I can lower that.
Yeah, it
right.
is virtual. Yeah.
There you go. Thanks, Judy, once again for speaking to us and being with us. I think I understand from your talks that by and large people got together. I mean, got along pretty well together.
Yeah.
In the various groups, the Black, Latino, whites, with an exception of the one young man you mentioned and so on. So it kind of goes against the grain of the old adage, familiarity breeds contempt, because people got to know each other and the different cultures in the prison experience. They didn't have anywhere else to go. It's just an observation, but certainly in our society, it seems like the white supremacists tend to be from, for example, in Michigan here, maybe live a little bit farther out or in all white communities where they don't have that interaction with people of color or anybody else, and they don't really want it. So it's the fear and the unknown that
Unknown,
right.
right.
I have to say that we live in a community that's very racially diverse, and we recognize that as young parents, and our kids grew up in a school system that had tremendous diversity, and they're all very, very open-minded today. So that's that at least in that very small sample size, I think that maybe people, when they're looking at communities, should not just look in an area that's all like them. and
Right.
That the mix of cultures is tremendously important, I think. So
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I'm just affirming, I think, what you were saying.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And think of the number of people who live in rural America, small town America, who've never seen anybody that's not like them. I grew up in a small town and everybody was my cousin. So I think that's part of the problem, that they watch TV and they see crime, black crime and shoot 'ems and blah, blah, blah. And they're afraid of them. They're afraid of the other, and the other happens to be people of color most of the time. So I think we need to understand that. It's hard and it's annoying, but it's very real.
And it's emphasized to great effect, as you sort of alluded to, by Trump and the right wingers.
Right.
They certainly foster that whole notion of others being bad and not
Right.
worthy, and not as good as them, and inferior in a way. So
Right. And there's an absolute deliberate attempt
yes,
divide. And I think we have to counteract that. It's up to us. It's not up to leaders. It's up to us.
Mhm.
So, Colleen?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I have two questions. One, what do you think about Biden and the marijuana issue? And two, can you share? Yeah, I figured. Thumbs up, everybody. And can you share what we can do about the systemic problems that cause the prison population to grow?
Well, I think from my small experience, it starts with good education.
Mm.
And when you look at Michigan's funding of education, I remember hearing about some new school in Birmingham or Bloomfield. There was a grand stairway in the lobby. Well, look at our Ann Arbor high schools, and one guy said, one day we were talking about dropping out, and I said, what, or I was talking to just him, now that I recall it. I said, well, can you tell me why you dropped out? He said, Ms. Winslow, it was damn cold in there. The windows were
Oh my
broken.
gosh.
Now, come on,
Wow.
So
Yeah.
we think, and we then punish them for, not going to school. And it's, yeah, so I would say that's the biggest thing we could do is be, and it's hard.
Education.
Yeah, it's hard.
Also, do you have hope that things will change?
I hang on to Brian Stevenson's hope. I think, again, fear and anger are tools of oppression. And on the other side of it, hope is a tool of looking forward and making things better. If we don't have hope, we don't do it. We're in despair.
That's right.
So, and I'm learning, I heard the other day about random acts of kindness and just how important and how far reaching they are. One of my daughters knows no stranger. She walks in and she talks to everybody like they're her sisters and brothers, and she just spreads it everywhere. And I learned from her to, I go to the grocery store and I think I just want to go home, but I try now to make myself chat and laugh and, just be friendly. I think little small things can add up. But it's hard. It's hard on some days to be hopeful.
I'm always hopeful. People just say, how can you be so positive? I choose that. It makes me happy. And I think kindness is a great thing. We just went to Belle Isle today with Stephen, George's son, Stephen, and his girlfriend came in from Yalapa, Mexico. And she was born in LA and was in Vegas and then Louisiana. She never saw the trees changing. She was just ecstatic. And we're down by the Detroit River, and there's this old guy and his lady, and he's fishing, and we all had just a great conversation. It was just really neat. We didn't know each other, but it was really nice, really very, very nice. She was so impressed taking all the pictures of the trees, especially this maple tree. She went up right inside of it, and she's got this photo that is just going to be on her wall when she gets back to Yalapa in Mexico. It was a great day. Great day. We enjoyed it. Yeah. So I always have.
Kim Bergier has had her virtual handout for some time now. So Kim, you've been very patient.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can. Yep.
Okay. Where to start? One of the things you said about owning our own heritage. I went to I organized a workshop in California, and one thing that stood out for me was when we went around the room to describe what we were proud of in our own heritage. And believe it or not, it's the white people that were having the hardest time.
Oh, right.
And so this is insightful to think
Mhm.
about that we're a mishmash,
Mhm.
often from different countries and ethnic groups. But I grew, this is shifting here, I grew up at an international school in northern India. So I grew up with being a minority and being stared at because I was white.
Mhm.
And so I had to learn how to deal with being surrounded by all brown people. But then I knew nothing about the African American community.
Mhm.
When I came to Maryville College in Tennessee, I actually made a conscious choice to get to know the African Americans with an independent study. For a month, I lived with an African American family. That didn't help a whole lot, but I was studying Martin Luther King and Gandhi and their connection. And but through the year, my parents were Methodist missionaries, so every 5 years we would come on furlough to the United States. So we go back to India, back to the States. So we had obviously had a global perspective that was unique. I've just been with 4 other classmates of mine who I've grew up with. We just spent 8 hours on the Agua Canyon train tour. So we were just amazed at how we could communicate and understand each other, like desperate to have that reinforcement, because otherwise we're feeling like fish out of water sometimes, just having a hard time adjusting to the American culture. Okay, so from the other perspective that I got from going back and forth is that I see within my lifetime, a lot more people are traveling. There's been a tremendous opening of cultural exchanges. And I just see what's happening with the white supremacists now is that they're facing the reality that they're the minority
Right.
in the
Right.
United States, right?
Right.
I don't know the current percentage but certainly with Hispanic, African American, Oriental, that there's a fear of
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
no longer having the power of being the majority.
Right. And
So
who am I? I don't want to speak Spanish, that they're afraid of that, of, losing their identity when they don't even really know their own identity. I have been hearing, I don't know if the rest of you have, I've been hearing about groups of, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Anybody read that? It's a wonderful book. And she talks about that when you raise one group, the rest, there's no zero-sum game. And she talks about Lewiston, Maine. I have a sister in Maine, and Lewiston was a dying town, like so many thousands of towns around the country are dying. And they got the mayor of Lewiston, Maine, somehow get this, Somalis to come who were refugees. Now, Somalis to Maine is kind of a big leap. And in 5 years, he insisted that they were welcomed. And of course, there were people who really resisted that. But overall, it worked. And it's still not easy, but a young Somali woman is on the city council. And the kids, of course, do fine. You put kids together, they don't know. And it's working. And then I heard of another town in Iowa that was dying, shrinking, and they got Mexicans. And the mayor there said, we're going to make this work. And before long, there were Mexican restaurants and Kids were learning Spanish in school. And again, not perfect, not easy, but that could be an answer. That we have rural America is disappearing. I think that's a large part of Trumpism, that they're scared. I don't blame them. It's, you lose your schools, you lose your church, you lose your hospital, can't sell your house, can't sell your farm. I get it. They're terrified. So that's the way these towns were begun in the first place, right? It was immigrants who founded those towns. So that's one, seems like one solution, especially with the immigration issue, which of course is huge too. So,
Well,
Rich-
yeah,
Rich
and
Peacock
of
hit-
course,
Oh,
the most of the Republicans of the states are the rural states,
right,
right?
right, right.
So it's really rural versus urban.
right. Yeah,
And
Yeah.
that is, no matter what country I've been in, that is the greatest difference is between rural and urban.
right,
Because most of the cities, actually in today's world, there's a McDonald's everywhere, right? You can, the cities around the world are more and more similar. People wearing Western dress or whatever.
mhm,
Whereas when we first traveled in 1963 through the Orient, Japanese were wearing kimonos. Those Japanese women. I mean, they were much more into their own historic culture
mhm,
than there are now. So in other
Right.
words, in the cities, there is the mixture.
right,
So the challenge is how to deal with the rural communities that are isolated and don't understand or feel frightened by those of
Yeah.
a mixed race.
they're
or
afraid
other
of a lot of,
colors.
yeah. I remember asking, one of my students had to do this cultural heritage thing, and he finally said, come on, Ms. They didn't pronounce my name right for 25 years. Come on, Ms. Winslow, I'm from the Burger King culture, okay? Yeah, that's about sums it up. That's what he felt like. So,
Rich has had his hand up for a while, his virtual hand. And also we have a couple of
Thank-
people in the chat box. I'm sorry to interrupt. but,
no, please.
yeah,
Thank you,
Rich,
Tara.
Yeah,
And Judy, thank you for your your empathy. It really comes through, and that's much appreciated. Thank you for your empathy.
Oh, thank you.
I put a resource in the chat, and the resource is an organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org.
Oh,
So they really put out some excellent educational materials. Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org.
wow.
Then I want to see what you think about this analysis and so forth. I believe that education opportunities in prisons have been curtailed because of COVID, having to keep prisoners isolated and so forth. And also there's a shortage, I believe, of prison workers.
Right, right.
Short staffing, which means
Right.
prisoners don't have as much freedom.
Right.
So are there any groups working on what you might call prison reform or any movements to try to solve some of these problems?
Many of them. Yep. Michigan, and I'm not familiar with the state system. It's very, very different. As prisons go, the federal system is far better. But yeah, the COVID has just really, it's been a nightmare. In Michigan, I read about a young man, maybe middle 30s, who had 3 children, and he got COVID and he died 1 month before his release date. So it just broke my heart. So I wrote to Gretchen Whitmer and said, please, can you facilitate these outdates and get these people out? Their lives are in danger. And the death toll in prisons was, there's no social distancing. The women in Michigan are in one prison between here and Milan. And the crowding, I haven't heard it lately, but I heard it last year. The crowding was so bad that women were sleeping in broom closets.
Hmm.
That's how, and you can imagine the COVID there. It's just been horrendous. So yeah, and staff were dying. I mean, it was prison. I can't think of anything worse than getting a pandemic in prison in terms of healthcare. My goodness. Yeah. And let me say this about education in prison. There are many, you've probably heard of Shakespeare in prison, and there was a wonderful PBS thing about college and graduate school in prison, which are all wonderful. Nobody's talking about the fact that so many of these people cannot read, and they are functionally illiterate in math. So we need the basics. There were prison staff that did, quote, education. Let me tell you, it was pretty embarrassing to even watch them. The men thought it was a big joke. But what they need is K-12. A lot of them are non-readers. They don't know any math. They don't know where they are. I had to teach Michigan history the first semester I was there. And I remember these guys from Mexico, they said, Michigan? Where Michigan? They had no idea where they even were. And then when I showed them the Great Lakes, they said, oh, wow, pretty water. I mean, it's just abysmal. And they're not alone. A lot of people, a lot of our school kids are in that position. But yeah, I don't know what we do. Prison reform, there are many, many groups, to answer your question. There are many, many groups that work on it nationally and statewide, often by people whose family members are locked up. So they're, eager to change the system.
There's something in one question in the chat that we haven't answered. I don't see it now. Jan had asked who was the author. Jan, I don't understand your question. Are you here? Where's Jan?
Yes, Judy, you mentioned an author. I didn't catch her name.
Oh, Heather McGee.
Heather what?
Heather McGee. I think it's
Thank you.
McGhee.
Thank you.
In the book of hers is called The Sum of Us, SUM. She's a policy person. You can get her on what's the TV, the TED Talks. She has a TED Talk.
Thanks.
She's just great. So, and in terms of fear, that's another fear that people have. Well, if Black people get rich, we're not gonna, we're gonna have less money. That's not true. That's not true. The fears are almost always irrational, right? We all have them. Mm-hmm. And she's very gentle about saying, this is not right. I just love her. I've followed her for a long time. I just really like her. There's so many great books out there. Oh my gosh. But Brian Stevenson, when I get really down, I go find him. He speaks everywhere, and it's not hard to just Google him and hear what he's said recently. And he never seems to lose his hope. I'm sure that in the dark of the night he does, but he projects this very positive, hopeful presence.
Who is he? Brian's
Bryan's Bryan Stevenson.
Mhm.
And he grew up in Maryland in a very lovely family, but his parents had never been to high school. And he ended up at Harvard Law after an exceptional student. And he didn't know what he was going to do as a lawyer. It just seemed like, well, everybody goes to law school. And he went down to Georgia one summer to work in a clinic for people on death row. And he met men on death row, and it totally changed his life. And he started working with death row inmates, many of whom we shouldn't have the death penalty to begin with, but a lot of them were innocent. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And then he started, this is 25 or 30 years ago, he started the Equal Justice Initiative. And he's got a big program out of Montgomery, Alabama, which of course has great historical significance. We were there, my friends and I were there for the opening of his museum, and it's the Museum of Race and Equality. I can't remember the name of it, but it had just opened that weekend, and I was standing looking at it's a very well done museum, and I heard somebody, sort of, this big tall man next to me was sort of sniffling, and I turned and it was Jesse Jackson with tears running down his cheeks. So, quite something. And then the other thing that he's done is in the same town in Montgomery, he built a indoor outdoor place that signifies lynching. And he has these long sort of coffin-like things that hang from the ceiling. And it's just, it's unbelievable how many thousands and thousands of people were lynched, but all the names are inscribed. And then the plan is that if a town wants that rectangular, looks like a coffin, in their town, they can have it. And so just to bring the awareness about lynching. And he says, we must deal with it before we move on. Is it ugly? Yes. But we must deal with it or we get stuck, which makes so much sense. And we're not very good at it. Americans are not very good at it. I remember that just a couple of months ago, the Canadians found a big mass grave of Indian children, and they freaked out. They just freaked out. Now, Canada's tiny compared to our population. In Canada, remember, and I was going to say, we have a melting pot. How many of us grew up with the whole idea of the immigrants came, you swirl them all together, and they come out looking like, oatmeal that, just doesn't have any color. Instead of what Canada does, partly because Canada is big and wide and has a very small population, but they're a mosaic. So the French are in Quebec, and the Native people are in the prairie provinces, and it's just, and then they have the Inuit people who are, they have their own culture, so they don't have a swirling kind of melting pot. Very different. And again, they're smaller and they can do it, but it's radically different in Canada.
See, I have my hand up, so I'm the only one.
Okay. Okay.
I'm gonna call on myself.
You go right ahead.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about how the division in particularly in our country is growing stronger and stronger, and what can we do about it? And I think there are a lot of things we could do to help it, but right now, to me, the most immediate thing is actually to vote so that we don't have a fascist government takeover, because that, to me, that's what's going on, in my opinion, is mainly the deliberate division so that an authoritarian fascist oligarchy can take over. And this is what happens all around the world. I go onto YouTube a lot, and I listen to authors who are experts on how authoritarianism and fascism takes over. And this is just, they're using that playbook in order to divide it so that they can take over, because we outnumber them, but by suppressing the vote and dividing us, and that's the way to divide people, is to get them angry and fearful. And then they don't think anymore. They say, "Oh, protect me."
Yeah, right.
And then 1/3 of humans have a natural authoritarian type personality, which is not bad. It's just what they're born with, and they are very susceptible to these authoritarian leaders and fascists. So I think what we can do is just get the vote out, because otherwise I'm afraid it's going to be too late. if we can't get the vote out at the midterms.
Right. I think the other part of the problem of fascism is democracy is really hard. It takes energy and working together and knowledge, and it's not easy. And it's easy to not participate. I don't know about you, but I don't like going to meetings. And I really admire people who join groups. I'm not very good in at that kind of thing. So, but that's the way work gets done in meeting fellow citizens. I mean, it's complicated. I used to tell my civic students, I want you to learn it, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's hard. So, it doesn't surprise me that the other side is getting larger and more powerful, because we live very complicated lives, as retirees. It's not so bad, but boy.
And Americans tend to take democracy for granted. We
Right,
think it's
right.
built in, but if you don't have a well-educated populace and an active citizenry and a free press, you're going to lose it. And we don't have
Right.
any of those. So
Right. And
we're,
we have Fox
we're in
News.
grave danger of losing it right now.
Right. Right.
We have a chance to not lose it, but it doesn't look good to me. Probably looks good to Colleen. Do you think?
Well,
Me?
and again, I don't think we can work hard if we don't have hope.
Right. I have hope, but
Yeah.
I not as much hope as Colleen. No.
Yeah.
Not that much hope.
Gosh, great comments.
So
What
if-
about
yeah.
one more thing? So I want to get back to belonging. So how do we belong to each other, and how can we get rid of that great divide, so that I'd like you to just think about that. I think about it all the time. It can come in many, many forms, but again, I'm just sort of charmed by the idea of small acts of kindness. I mean, every day, if we all did that all day long, it would be powerful. It would matter. And all of us can't do anything about the election in South Dakota, but we can certainly do it in our own neighborhoods. We can try harder.
An answer that I would recommend for getting rid of the great divide. I'm not going to get into it, but it's what I call the evolutionary spiritual perspective. It's a kind of a philosophy where we all came from the same source, and you could call it God, or you can have a purely scientific view of it, which is, if you go back, I think I forget, 13 billion years or 8 billion years. I can never remember numbers, but it all started, as far as we know, it all started from basically probably pure consciousness, and so we are really one, and we can participate now in evolution in a conscious way.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
recognize our oneness.
Yep. What we have in common, and also celebrate our differences. It's just really as simple as that. Yeah.
So if there are no more questions, or Judy, did you have more to?
Well, Tata, she asked us, can I go?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, she asked us, one way of connecting or whatever. I thought of, somebody told me once, when we see people, say, on the street panhandling or something like that, we can be deluged by that every day, just saying it in and out, acknowledge them, say hi. We don't have to give them money, just reaching out to our fellow human beings. I think simple acts of that kindness just, is another way. And of course, like I did with my life, just get out there and get out of our comfort zone by volunteering or, getting into situations that aren't familiar. Like you say, we tend to, I'll never forget a psychologist once was doing a warm-up exercise, and she fixed an animal name to everybody and told them to make that animal noise. Everybody had a different animal, and she wanted them, just by their noise, animal noise they made, to group together and not to let anybody know that they were a cow or a cat or whatever. So they all would end up in this big room, all these people mix up, making all these animal noises, and they grouped. And she says that's so often what we do. We go to what's familiar to us.
Right, right,
And if we choose to get out of that mold,
Right.
and it's not always comfortable, but it can be life-changing and life-altering for the world, I do believe. Yeah.
right. Speaking of homelessness, if you need a vibrant speaker, I have an old friend who's the point person for the homeless organizations in Ipsy and Ann Arbor, and has been for a long time. She is amazing. Oh my gosh, I don't know anybody like her. She does amazing work, and I've learned a lot about homeless people, and what to do for them and with them.
So, excuse me, Rich Peacock just said that he's leaving. Rich, do you want to just say something before you totally leave us? Because you're our next speaker.
Sure. Sure. We're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years later,
Oh, wow.
especially in relation to what is now called Ukraine, a slow-moving Cuban Missile Crisis. In the meantime, urge President Biden to prioritize diplomacy, urge President Biden to cancel the NATO nuclear war games. We don't need escalation. So that's, in the meantime, we'll have more in November. We have to get the United States on a peacemaking track.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great.
Thank you.
Great.
Look forward.
If anybody wants my book, I'm happy to send it. $22 with postage. So,
Yeah. Oh, just,
Colleen,
yeah, I was just going to say, I think we can send it out, and like I did before, and in fact, it's still on the website from your previous talk, how to get your book. But I think we can email people that some people couldn't come today, and we'll send that out.
okay,
Yeah, thanks, Judy.
okay.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Judy.
This has been delightful. Thank you for all
Oh.
your comments.
For
Yeah.
us too. Thank you. Yeah.
So it's time for our business meeting. It's going to be short. And
So I will say goodbye.
okay.
Have a great
thank
trip to
you.
Quebec with
Thank
your
you,
family.
thank you. I
Bye,
will.
Judy, and
Enjoy.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So I want to thank everybody for being here and for asking such great questions and making such great comments. And I think that Jan, who is the head of our education committee, is going to say just a little bit, right, Jan?
If you want. Tata, you were going to mention how much money we have in our treasuries, our balances.
Oh, you know, yeah, I forgot to get hold of
Oh,
that.
that's
but
okay
I
then.
can send it out, we've got,
Okay.
we don't have to worry, we can pay our speakers for another year or so, I
You're
think.
funny.
Hopefully we could do some more. We earned over $300, didn't we, Colleen? Wasn't it 340 something in our book sale that we had? I deposited it, but I don't remember numbers very well. So we're doing okay for now, we don't have to rent hall anymore. Our only real expense right now is just our speaker fees, which is like $100 when we have speakers, so.
Okay, so I think what you wanted me to do is just talk about, just a couple minutes about what we did in September. We had displays again at a few of the libraries around the area, including Canton, Farmington Hills, Oak Park, Westland, and Waterford. And who am I forgetting? I'm forgetting one.
I think it was just 5 this time.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
yeah.
And Linda Leader, who's not here tonight, but so she doesn't get to hear her praise, but she put together a very thoughtful speech for the Westland Library right on the International Day of Peace on the 21st of September. And she talked about the history of the day and the theme for this year, which is End Racism, Build Peace. And unfortunately, it wasn't that well attended, but it doesn't mean that Linda didn't really put a lot of effort into it. She had a PowerPoint and handouts, and it was because Colleen was there. She said it was a very lovely talk.
It was.
That's what we did this year, and I want to wrap all this up by saying our committee can use a couple new members. We were going to be doing some brainstorming at our last meeting, but we've had a decimation of the ranks, and so we're looking for a couple of new members due to illness and other commitments. A couple of people kind of had to drop out. So before we get into our planning sessions for next year, we would really like a new member or two. And from what I've heard tonight and all these fabulous comments and questions, anybody here would be a great addition to our team. So let me know if you'd like. We don't even meet every month. It's not a huge commitment. So would love to have you.
Oh, we had 2 announcements in the chat box. Now,
Oh,
another one, Vic Max died. Oh yeah, Keith mentioned that to me too. And then Bob Podzakowski said that Angela Lansbury died. Okay, let's see. Wait, I'm trying to change this view. Oh, you know what? I think I gotta stop the recording.